Hey there, come closer to the fire, because tonight we are standing in a museum basement with a clay tablet that looks harmless until you learn what it says. It is pale, small, and quiet, about the size of a hardcover book, resting somewhere in the careful hush of a collection room. The air is controlled. The light is soft. The tablet does not move. Yet across its dry surface are wedge-shaped marks made by a human hand almost 4,000 years ago. And those marks describe something colder than a ghost story. They describe an organized passage for the dead. Not a vague shadow world. Not a misty place beyond memory. A system. A soul arrive. A gate is opened. A name is written. Gifts are expected. Judges are waiting. And somewhere below the earth, in the great dark that Sumerians called by many names, the Anunnaki sit like officers of a court that every human being must eventually enter. If this kind of slow journey through ancient tablets, underworld gates, and the strange machinery of death keeps you listening, leave a like and subscribe. It helps keep this small candle burning for the next person who finds these old questions in the dark. Now, let the room grow dim around us. The fire is steady. The candle is low. We are not rushing into the underworld. Even the dead, according to these tablets, had to pass through the proper gates. Imagine the tablet first. It is not grand in the way a golden mask is grand. It does not shine. It does not command the eye from across a room. It is clay, the color of pale sand, fragile in the way time makes things fragile. Not broken into dust, not screaming for attention, simply carrying the weight of everything it has outlived. Cities, languages, kings, scribes, umpire. The hand that pressed those signs into it has been gone for so long that even the grave of that hand has probably returned to the anonymous earth. Yet the signs remain. Honestly, I have always found clay tablets unsettling. Paper can burn. Ink can fade. A voice disappears as soon as it is spoken. But clay, once fired or hardened by chance, becomes stubborn. It lies under soil. It waits through collapse. It lets generations forget it, and then one day, a worker lifts it from the ground, and the dead begin speaking again. This tablet, known in the Istanbul collection as NI 368, belongs to the tradition of Inanna and her descent to the netherworld. Its opening line is one of the most arresting in ancient literature. From the great heaven, she set her mind on the great below. That is not a beginning that wanders. It descends at once. From the great heaven to the great below, a goddess makes a decision, and the entire story begins moving downward. The source text makes clear that this is not simply a tale about travel. It is not a heroic adventure, not a list of kings, not a record of grain deliveries or sheep or beer jars, though the Sumerians were certainly fond of recording those too. This is a story that opens a door into what the ancient people of Mesopotamia imagined happened after death. More precisely, it opens a door into a process. That word matters. Process. The afterlife described in these tablets is not only a place, it is an administration. A structured realm with gates, guardians, officials, scribes, judges, rules, offerings, and assignments. The dead are not merely drifting. They are received, examined, recorded, and placed. The Anunnaki appear here not as modern legends like visitors from stars, not as the loud figures of speculative programs and late-night arguments, but as judges and administrators of the underworld. The modern world has taken the word Anunnaki and wrapped it in many strange lights. Anciens astronautes, genetic engineers, hidden masters, visitors from elsewhere. Those conversations exist, and they are not part of the path we are walking tonight. Tonight, we stay closer to the clay. We listen to what the tablets themselves say, and what they say is already strange enough. The underworld had gates, 7 of them. Each gate had a guardian. Each crossing required submission. In some accounts, there was a river to cross, a gatekeeper to satisfy, gifts to present to named officials, and a scribe who wrote down the names of those who arrived. The soul entered a realm that functioned almost like a city office beneath the earth, though colder, older, and far less forgiving about paperwork. There is a little dry humor in that, if you allow it. Even death, in the Sumerian imagination, seems to have had administration. No one escaped the queue. Not kings, not warriors, not priests, not even a goddess descending in splendor from the open sky. If you were standing beside me in that museum basement, you might lean closer to the glass. The tablet would still look quiet. The wedge marks would look like little birds' feet pressed into mud, or tiny cuts made by a tool too patient to be human. Each sign would hold a sound. Each sound would hold a word. Each word would hold a rule about the dead. In the dim room, the hum of machines would seem almost disrespectfully modern. Air flowing through vents. Temperature held steady. A glass case sealing the ancient object away from breath and fingers. Yet inside that quiet, the first line still moves. From the great heaven, she set her mind on the great below. The great below had many names. Kur, a word that could mean mountain or foreign land, a place remote and difficult. Irgalla, associated with the queen of the dead. Arali, shadowed and uncertain. Kigal, the great below. Kuku, darkness. Each name is like a different door into the same cold place. A culture does not give many names to something it barely thinks about. Many names mean repeated fear, repeated ritual, repeated imagination. To the Sumerians, death was not nothing. It was a relocation. A human body returned to clay, but something of the person continued, not in comfort, not in bright paradise, but as a ghostly presence that still had needs. Hunger, thirst, memory, social place, family ties, ritual dependence. A dead person could be at rest, or not. A properly handled soul could belong to the underworld. An improperly handled one could trouble the living. This is why the system mattered. A soul that was not processed correctly was not merely sad. It could become dangerous. It could wander. It could bring illness, bad dreams, affliction, the unsettling sense that the boundary between house and grave had thinned. So the passage had to be managed. Imagine the staircase. It is not a modern staircase with railings and helpful lights. It is imagined as a descent under the soil, beneath the place where roots drink water, below even the hidden freshwater ocean that Mesopotamians believed lay under the earth. The air cools. The sound of the living world grows thinner behind you. Your footsteps meet stone or packed earth. Dust lifts with each step and settles slowly. Somewhere far below, water moves without light. At the bottom waits the first gate. A gate is a simple object, but in myth it becomes a sentence. It says, "You may go no farther unless the one who guards me allows it." The gate is not only wood or bronze or shadow. It is law made visible. Inanna arrives not as a frightened mortal, but as a goddess of love, war, power, and the planet Venus. She comes dressed in signs of authority. She comes prepared. She comes with regalia that marks who she is in the world above. And still, the underworld does not bend for her. The gatekeeper Neti stops her. He questions her. He consults Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. Only then is she admitted. Even divine urgency must wait while the underworld follows procedure. This is the first cold truth of the tablets. The underworld has its own laws. The rights of the underworld, the me of the underworld, cannot simply be challenged. At each gate, when Inanna protests, the answer repeats. She must be satisfied. She must not speak against the rights of the underworld. The repetition is important. It sounds almost liturgical, not emotional, not cruel in a dramatic way, just final. At the first gate, something is taken. Then the second, then the third. Gate by gate, she is reduced. This is where the story becomes more than narrative. It becomes a theory of identity. What are you when authority is removed? What are you when beauty is removed? What are you when wealth is removed? What are you when the instruments of planning, rushe, attracting, commanding, and being recognized, are taken from you? The Sumerians did not ask this in abstract language. They put a goddess at the gates. They took away her ornaments. They let the underworld answer without sympathy. And the Anunnaki waited deeper inside, not as monsters leaping from darkness, but as judges whose power was colder because it was orderly. The soul processing system, if we use that phrase, begins to show its shape here. First the arrival, then the gates, then the stripping of status, then the presentation before authority, then the judgment or assignment, then the recording and placement. That is what makes the source so haunting. It is not only that ancient people feared death. Everyone fears death in some language. It is that they imagined death as an organized passage, almost bureaucratic, almost legal, with officials who knew exactly what to do when you arrived. There is something deeply human in that fear. We know how frightening chaos can be, but order can be frightening too. especially when it is impersonal. A storm may kill without intention. A judge looks at you and decides. The Anunnaki look. In Inanna descent, that gaze becomes deadly. The 7 judges render their decision. Their look is the look of death. Their speech is anger. Their shout is heavy guilt. The goddess is condemned by the law of the place she chose to enter. For ordinary mortals, the situation is different, because they arrive already dead. The judgment cannot mean death in the same way. It must mean assignment, plaismo, registration, a decision about where and how the soul will exist in the underworld community. That is the dark precision of the system, not heaven and hell as later traditions might imagine, not simple reward and punishment. A layered underworld where status, burial, family, offerings, manner of death, and ritual correctness all mattered. The dead were sorted. The name was written. The place was given. And somewhere behind it all stood the ancient conviction that death did not erase administration. It continued it. The fire beside us shifts. A log settles. The candle flame bends slightly, then steadies. Return for one moment to the tablet under glass. It has no voice unless someone reads it. It has no warmth unless a living mind brings warmth to it. But its words have survived almost 4,000 years to give us this image. A soul descending through gates, stripped of borrowed power, brought before judges, and entered into the ledgers of the great below. The first gate is open now in the imagination. The stair has gone down. The tablet has spoken. But before we follow the soul any farther, we need to understand the people who wrote this down, because the Sumerians were not casual dreamers making little stories for idle evenings. They were record keepers, builders of cities, makers of law, and guardians of memory. And when such a people writes that even the dead are processed, we should listen carefully. To understand the tablet, we have to step away from the underworld for a little while and climb back into the world of the living. Not because the dead have become less important, but because the people who wrote about them matter. A civilization tells you something about itself by what it chooses to record. Some people record victories. Some record taxes. Some record prayers. The Sumerians recorded all of those. And then, with the same patient seriousness, they recorded what a soul should expect after death. Picture another object under museum light. Not a flat tablet this time, but a clay prism. It stands upright, four-sided, covered from top to bottom in columns of cuneiform signs. It looks like a small brown tower taught to remember. This is the Weld Blundell prism, kept in Oxford, better known as one of the main witnesses to the Sumerian king list. The king list begins with a sentence that sounds like a door opening into myth. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. Read that slowly. Kingship descended. Not grew. Not was invented. Not was negotiated by village elders after someone made too much noise near the grain stores. It descended from heaven. The first city named is Eridu, a real place in southern Mesopotamia, old, low, and weathered by time. Then the prism gives names of kings. and the lengths of their reigns. And here the numbers become almost dreamlike. The first king, Alulim, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. The second, Alulgar, for 36,000 years. Others follow with reigns too vast for normal history. Then comes the line that changes the air. The flood swept over. After the flood, the reigns shrink. Still long at first, but less impassible. Then hundreds of years. Then decades. Human time returns, slowly, as if history itself were cooling from myth into record. Mainstream scholarship treats those immense early reigns carefully. They are usually read as literary exaggeration, sacred numbers used to place earliest kings in mythic time, to make later dynasties feel connected to divine order. That is a strong interpretation. It makes sense. Ancient cultures often used impossible numbers to mark sacred antiquity. But the source asks us not to ignore the strange balance in the document. The reigns are impossible, yet the cities are real. Eridu was real. Bad Tabira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. These were not random fantasy names tossed into a poem. They belong to a real Mesopotamian landscape. Some have been excavated. They sit in ancient layers of settlement, mood break, pottery, flood memories, and political history. The king list does not float freely in imagination. It ties mythic time to actual geography. That is what makes Sumerian writing so difficult to dismiss. It can sound wild. Then it names a real city. It can speak of heaven. Then it gives an administrative sequence. It can say kingship descended. Then it tracks how authority moved from one city to another, like a sacred office being transferred across the plain. If you were standing with me in the museum, looking at the prism, you might notice how crowded the writing is. No empty flourish. No decorative generosity. The signs are packed tightly, as if the scribe knew clay was not to be wasted. Each wedge is a decision to preserve. The Sumerians were people of records. They are among the earliest people whose writing can be confirmed. Their tablets reach back into the 4th millennium before the Common Era. At first, many signs served practical needs: counting grain, livestock, lavor, offerings, jars, fields, and transaction. Writing did not begin as poetry in a moonlit room, however pleasant that would be. It began because someone needed to remember who owed what. There is, I think, a charming honesty in that. Civilization may dream of eternity, but first it must count sheep. From those early records grew a world of astonishing administrative power. The Sumerians helped shape systems that still shadow our lives. The 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, legal codes, medical texts, literary catalogs, scribal schools, Templar archive. These were not a loose people of casual stories. They measured, counted, classified, copied, and stored. This matters because when such a civilization records an underworld system, it does so in the language it knows best. Administration. The dead are not merely mourned. They are processed, A name is not merely remembered. It is written. A place is not merely imagined. It is assigned. The source also introduces the Sumerian idea of the me, divine ordinances, powers, rules, and cultural patterns. They covered kingship, priesthood, writing, music, law, craft, descent to the underworld, and ascent from it. They were not human inventions in Sumerian understanding. They were received, preserved, transmitted from a divine order older than the city itself. This is the world that preserves the afterlife texts. A world where knowledge is not casual. A world where the sacred is organized. A world where even death may have a procedure because the cosmos itself has procedure. Now let the landscape widen. The civilization of Sumer flourished in the flat alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In what is now southern Iraq, the land there was rich and difficult. Rivers gave life, but not always gently. Floods could bless or destroy. Fields needed canals. Canals needed labor. Cities needed grain. Temples needed offerings. Officials needed records, and records needed scribes. The cities rose from mud and water. Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, Eridu, Umma. Their names feel old in the mouth, like stones worn smooth by many hands. By around 2600 before the Common Era, Uruk may have held tens of thousands of people, making it one of the largest urban places on Earth at the time. This was no little camp of dreamers by a river. This was urban life, dense, managed, ambitious, and fragile. Markets, granarias, temples, schools, canals glittering in hard sun, scribes with reed styluses, priests with ritual duties, workers moving grain, and underneath it all, the sense that human order reflected a divine order. When Sargon of Akkad later unified Mesopotamian cities into an empire, Sumerian political independence changed, but Sumerian culture did not vanish. Its language remained sacred and scholarly for centuries, and later scribes copied, translated, adapted, and preserved Sumerian texts. The underworld system was not a small eccentric belief at the edge of society. It belonged to the core imagination of Mesopotamian religion. Now follow the tablets into the ground. In the late 19th century, excavators turned their attention to the great mound of Nippur, Ancien Nibru, a sacred city of Enlil. Nippur was not always the political capital. It did not need to be. It had something more durable, theological centrality. If a king wanted legitimacy, Nippur mattered. If a law needed divine authority, Nippur mattered. If one wanted to stand near the imagined place where the divine assembly gave weight to earthly rule, Nippur mattered. There, under accumulated debris, lay tablets, thousands of them, tens of thousands. The University of Pennsylvania expeditions, beginning under John Punnet Peters in the 1880s, uncovered a vast written world. The work was difficult, dangerous, and imperfect by modern standards, but it recovered an extraordinary archive of ancient writing. Out of Nippur came many of the texts that shape our understanding of Sumerian mythology and afterlife belief. Fragments of Inanna descent, Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld, the death of Ur-Namma, hymns to Utu, Lamis, ritual texts, incantation, school tablets copied by students in the Adaba, the tablet house. That detail is important. Many surviving tablets are not original compositions from the moment a story first emerged. They are copies, often old Babylonian school copies of works already ancient to the students who copied them. Imagine a young scribe around 1800 before the Common Era, sitting with damp clay, copying a text that may already have been centuries old. His teacher watches. The student presses each sign carefully. Perhaps he is bored. Perhaps he fears making an error. Perhaps he does not know that one day people far beyond his imagination will stare at his homework and call it sacred literature. History has a dry sense of humor. This creates a layered problem. We are often reading copies of older compositions, preserving traditions that claim to remember even older mythic time. A copy of a record of a memory. That does not make the texts worthless. It makes them deep. It asks us to listen with caution. We cannot pretend every line is direct reportage. We also cannot pretend it is meaningless. Then came the great modern challenge, reading the signs. Cuneiform was lost for many centuries. No living person could read it. Its recovery required patience, danger, and a cliff in western Iran. The Behistun inscription, carved under the Persian king Darius, preserved the same royal proclamation in several languages and scripts. Henry Rawlinson copied the inscription in the 19th century, working on dangerous rock faces. Other scholars helped crack the system. Akkadian cuneiform was difficult enough. Sumerian was harder. Sumerian is a language isolate. It has no known living relatives, no convenient cousin language waiting nearby to help. Scholars had to reconstruct meaning through context, bilingual lists, lexical tablets, and the careful work of scribes from the ancient world who had already known that Sumerian needed explaining to later readers. Ancient Babylonian scribes made Sumerian-Akkadian dictionaries, and thousands of years later, modern scholars needed those school tools to hear the older language again. Samuel Noah Kramer later made many of these myths legible to a wider world. Later scholars corrected and refined his readings, but he helped show that the Sumerian underworld was not a vague pit, but a structured realm with officials, procedures, named powers, and internal law. So we return now to the tablet with more respect. The Sumerians measured fields and skies. They tracked kings and cattle. They wrote laws and medical recipes. They preserved old compositions in schools. They copied what they believed mattered. They did not, as far as we can tell, write carelessly when durable clay was involved. And among the things they preserved was the idea that after death, a soul entered a system. This does not prove the system was real in any modern scientific sense. We cannot walk into Kur with a lantern and check the registry. We cannot interview the gatekeeper. We cannot ask the Anunnaki whether the paperwork was filed correctly. The evidence does not allow that. But it does show that the Sumerians took the idea seriously. Seriously enough to name gates. Seriously enough to name officials. Seriously enough to describe gifts. Seriously enough to imagine a scribe writing down the dead. The fire beside us burns low and steady. A little ash falls inward, and the world of Sumer begins to gather around the tablet. The prism with impossible kings. The floodline. The ancient cities. The scribal schools. The buried libraries. The scholars bending over fragments. The dead waiting below the soil. The clay has not answered the great question yet, but it has made the question harder to ignore. If a civilization of record keepers believed death had an administration, then the next thing we must do is walk through the architecture of that administration, step by step, gate by gate, into the great below. The architecture of death begins in a buried city. Before we descend fully into the 7 gates, we have to stand for a while at Nippur, because many of the words that guide us downward rose first from that dust. Nippur was not the kind of city that needed a king's palace to be powerful. Its strength was older and quieter. It was a sacred center, the city of Enlil, Lord of Wind, storm, and divine authority. If you were walking there in its ancient life, you might not feel power in one single moment. You would feel it in repetition. Footsteps over packed earth. Priests carrying offerings at regular hours. Scribes moving between rooms with clay tablets pressed against their chests. Smoke rising from ritual fires. The smell of grain, wool, oil, baked bread, and river mud. Authority here did not shout from a balcony. It settled into procedure. At the heart of the city stood the Eker, the mountain house. The name itself is heavy. A mountain made into a temple, or a temple imagined as a mountain. In the flat lands between the rivers, where the horizon could seem almost endless, a sacred height mattered. It gave the eye somewhere to climb. It gave the city a center. It suggested that decisions made in heaven might touch earth through brick, stair, courtyard, and shrine. The Sumerians imagined Nippur as a place connected to the divine assembly, a place where the decisions governing the universe had weight. Kings sought legitimacy there. Law needed sacred sanction there. Even when political capitals rose elsewhere, Nippur remained the kind of city a ruler ignored only if he had a taste for bad luck. And most kings, whatever else they were, preferred luck to be polite. Then the city fell quiet. Centuries passed. Dust gathered. Walls slumped. Streets disappeared under debris. The tablets slept. In the late 19th century, John Punnett Peters arrived with an American expedition and a difficult ambition. He was not an archaeologist in the modern sense. The discipline itself was still rough, full of courage, errors, fragile methods, and large hats in punishing sun. But he believed Nippur mattered, and in that he was right. The mound rose from the Mesopotamian plain like a body covered by time. Workers cut into it. Baskets of earth moved. Dust clung to skin and clothing. The heat could be merciless. Camp life was difficult. There were attacks, burned supplies, returns. departures, and returns again. Archaeology in those days was not the quiet museum work people imagine later. It was labor, danger, bargaining, heat, dust, and stubbornness. Then clay came out of the ground. Not one tablet, not a few, thousands. Eventually, about 30,000 cuneiform tablets were recovered from Nippur and its scribal context. Administrative texts, school exercises, hymns, myths, laments, rituals, fragments of compositions that had outlived the hands that wrote them. It is difficult to picture that many tablets unless you slow down. A room of them. Then another room. Shelves of baked memory. Broken corners. Missing lines. Names of gods. Lists of offerings. Student mistakes. Royal names. Underworld prayers. A whole civilization speaking in pieces. Among those pieces were the texts we need tonight. Inanna descent, Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld, the death of Ur-Nama, hymns to Utu, laments, incantations for the dead. These were not all complete tablets, lying politely in order, as if waiting for a scholar to enjoy an easy afternoon. They were fragments, some small enough to fit in the palm, some broken across museums in different countries, some with signs worn by time until reading became a kind of listening with the eyes. This is where modern scholarship enters the story, not as cold interruption, but as another layer of patience. A student scribe in ancient Nippur once copied an older text. He pressed the signs into wet clay. Maybe his teacher corrected him. Maybe he made a mistake and smoothed the clay to try again. Maybe he was bored. Maybe he understood the gravity of what he copied. We cannot know. But his tablet survived. Then, thousands of years later, a scholar lifted a fragment from a tray and tried to hear it. Honestly, there is something almost tender about that chain. A young scribe copying an ancient story by lamplight. A modern scholar bent over the same signs under electric light. Between them, amperes, languages, religion, vars, museums, and dust. The story passing not smoothly, but enough. Yet the chain is complicated. Most of the surviving copies of Sumerian literary works come from the Old Babylonian period, around the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era. But the compositions themselves were older. Many may reach back to the Ur-3 period or earlier. The events they describe belong to mythic time, often before or just after the flood. So what we read is layered. A copy of an older text. A school exercise preserving a sacred tradition. A memory of a world already ancient when the student wrote it. That does not weaken the mystery. It thickens it. The dead in these tablets are not floating through a vague dark. They are entering a tradition so durable that generation after generation learn to copy it. But for many centuries, no one could read the signs at all. Cuneiform fell silent. The wedge script, once used across Mesopotamia, disappeared from living knowledge. Clay tablets lay in ruins, but their voices were locked. It took the 19th century and a cliff face at Behistun in western Iran to begin opening them again. Imagine that cliff. High stone. Wind. A royal inscription carved under Darius of Persia. The same message written in multiple scripts. Henry Rawlinson, a British officer, risked his life copying the signs, hanging from ropes, working against height and stone. Other scholars, Edward Hincks, Jules Appert, William Henry Fox Talbot, helped crack the system. The work was slow, uncertain, and full of correction. Akkadian could be read with help from related Semitic languages. Sumerian was harder. Sumerian is a language isolate. It has no known living relatives, no sister language waiting nearby with familiar words. Translators had to rely on context, repeated formulas, bilingual lexical lists, and the ancient dictionaries created by Babylonian scribes who themselves were preserving a dead scholarly language. Those scribes, long gone, became teachers to modern scholars without intending it. I like that detail. The ancient students needed word lists. Modern scholars needed the same word lists. Across 4,000 years, everyone is still doing homework. Samuel Noah Kramer later helped bring Sumerian mythology into clearer view for a broad audience. His translations were refined by later scholars, and some readings were corrected, as scholarship should be. But his work made one thing unmistakable. The Sumerian underworld was not merely a sad hole in the ground. It had structure. It had names. It had gates. It had judges. It had officials who registered and assigned the dead. Now let the excavation dust settle, and let the descent begin. The underworld had many names, and each name gives us a different angle of fear. Kur, a word that could mean mountain or foreign land, a place beyond familiar borders. Irkal, linked to the queen of the dead. Arali, shadowed in uncertainty. Kigal, the great below. Kuku, darkness. The Akkadian word Ereshkigal and the realm of Ereshkigal later echo through this world like a royal title spoken in a room where no one smiles. Multiple names do not make the place unclear. They make it thick with meaning. The dead were below, but also far away. Beneath the earth, but also foreign. Dark, but ordered. A place of absence, but crowded with offices. The underworld lay under the soil, under the surface from which clay was taken and to which the body returned. It lay beneath even the Apsu, the hidden fresh water deep from which rivers were imagined to spring. In some traditions, it was associated with the West, where the sun descends and day gives itself to darkness. Utu, the sun god, did not vanish at sunset. He traveled below, through the realm of the dead, before rising again in the east. That image will matter later. For now, the path descends. A staircase leads downward. The air cools. The sound of the living world thins. Behind you are fields, voices, lamps, bread, children, arguments, the smell of smoke, and all the little proofs that life is still moving. Ahead is a gate, then another, then another. 7 gates. The number 7 mattered deeply in Mesopotamian thought. 7 judges, 7 gates, 7-day mourning, 7 divine powers in many traditions. It was not random decoration. It gave structure to the invisible. It made the underworld feel counted, measured, complete. Each gate had a bolt. Each gate had a guardian. Each gate required submission. Inanna descent gives the clearest ritual picture. She comes to the palace of the underworld entrance, called Ganzir in the tradition. She is stopped by Neti, the gatekeeper. Neti does not simply let her pass because she is powerful. He goes to Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, and reports that Inanna has arrived. There is something chillingly official about it. The gatekeeper consults the ruler. The arrival is processed. Permission is granted, but only under the laws of the place. At each gate, an item is removed from Inanna. When she protests, the answer comes back with ritual force. She must not speak against the rights of the underworld. A divine ordinance has been fulfilled. The phrase suggests that the gatekeeper is not being personally cruel. He is enforcing law. That may be worse. Personal cruelty can be pleaded with. Law only repeats itself. The first gate opens. A sign of rule is taken. The second gate opens. Another sign is removed. Gate by gate, the goddess of the upper world becomes less able to carry that world with her. Authority falls away. Ornament falls away. Fertility, attraction, wealth, planning, identity, all will be removed in time. But here, before we watch each item closely, pause at the sound of the gates themselves. A bolt sliding. A threshold passed. A silence after protest. The underworld is not rushing. It has all the time death has, which is to say, more than anyone entering it would prefer. By the time Inanna reaches the inner court, she is no longer clothed in the powers that defined her above. That is the purpose of the architecture. It does not simply move a soul from place to place. It strips. It reduces. It presents the arrival before the judges in a state where titles cannot hide the essential thing. The source asks the question gently but firmly. What remains when everything is removed? That question is waiting at the end of the 7th gate. The museum tablet waits too. The scribal school waits. The underworld waits with its bolts, guardians, and cold procedure. And deeper inside, the Anunnaki are seated. Deeper inside, the Anunnaki are seated. But before their gaze falls on Inanna, we need to slow the final descent. The 7 gates are not just a hallway with interruptions. They are a ceremony of loss. They remove the pieces of identity in order, as if the underworld knows that a being cannot be judged while still wrapped in the costumes of power. Inanna arrives dressed for the world above. She is not careless. She has prepared herself with 7 items, each one more than decoration. Each one is a form of authority. In the Sumerian imagination, these are connected to the me, the divine ordinances and powers that make roles, cities, rituals, arts, and offices function. Inanna does not merely wear jewelry. She wears categories of command. At the first gate, the turban or crown of rulership is removed from her head. Feel the cold of that moment. The head, once marked by authority, becomes uncovered. The open country, the lands over which she had power, are no longer hers to command here. A crown belongs to a realm that recognizes it. In the underworld, recognition must be granted by the underworld itself. Inanna asks what this means. The answer returns, calm and finale. The rites of the underworld must be fulfilled. At the second gate, the lapis lazuli beads are taken from her neck. Lapis was precious, deep blue, linked in color and imagination to the heavens. It was not local stone casually picked from a roadside. It traveled through trade routes and desire, a blue deep enough to seem like a fragment of sky held in the hand. Around Inanna's neck, it marked divine status. When it is removed, the blue of heaven leaves her throat. At the third gate, the twin egg-shaped beads from her breast are removed. These suggest fertility, generation, creative force, the mystery by which life comes forward. Above ground, Inanna is tied to desire, growth, attraction, and the dangerous beauty that draws beings toward one another. But the underworld is not impressed by fertility. It is the place where growth ends. So the signs of life-making are taken. At the fourth gate, the breast pectoral called "Come, Man, Come" is removed. This object is linked to her power of attraction and influence, the force that bends the living toward her. Influence matters greatly above. A ruler can command, but one who attracts can rule hearts before issuing orders. Inanna is a goddess who understands that. She is not only power by decree, she is power by pull. The underworld takes that too. At the fifth gate, the golden ring is removed from her hand. Gold catches light. It speaks of wealth, possession, material authority. A ring on the hand can seal, command, promise, own. But the dead carry no wealth that can buy exemption from the law below. The hand opens. The ring is gone. The fingers are bare. Honestly, there is something deeply unsettling in the removal of a ring. Crowns are public. Jewels can be formal, but a ring sits close to daily gesture. It moves when the hand moves. It becomes part of the body confidence. Without it, the hand looks slightly more alone. At the sixth gate, the measuring rod and measuring line of lapis lazuli are taken. These are not ornaments. They are instruments of planning, architecture, governance, cosmic arrangement. The gods measure space. Builders measure walls. Rulers measure land. To measure is to impose order. To hold a measuring rod is to say that the world can be divided, named, planned, and governed. The underworld takes the tools of order away from her. At the seventh gate, the royal garment is removed. This is the last and most intimate loss. Clothing is not simply cloth. It is role, recognition, dignity. The garment of leadership tells the world how to see the one who wears it. When it is removed, Inanna is left without the final sign of office. No crown, no beads, no ring, no instruments, no garment. She enters the tribunal stripped of what made her Inanna in the world above. The sequence is cold because it is so ordered. It does not tear everything away at once. It removes layer after layer, each with meaning. Territorial power, divine status, fertility, attraction, wealth, cosmic governance, identity. By the time she stands before Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki, she has been reduced to presence without protection. The Queen of Heaven has become an arrival. That word is important. Arrival. In this system, every soul is an arrival. A king may arrive as a king, but the gates test what kingship means below. A rich person may arrive with goods, but goods must be presented correctly. A priest may arrive with ritual knowledge, but the underworld has its own rights. Inanna arrives as a goddess, but the underworld does not allow her to carry upper world sovereignty past its thresholds. She stands before the 7 Anunnaki judges. The text describes the moment with remarkable brevity. They look at her. It is the look of death. They speak to her. It is the speech of anger. They shout at her. It is the shout of heavy guilt. There are no long arguments, no witnesses, no defense speech, no dramatic court scene where a clever advocate softens the verdict. The judgment is perception, speech, pronouncement, a look, a word, a shout. It is almost too direct to be human law. Human law often needs ceremony because humans do not see fully. These judges, in the text, seem to see something at once. What exactly do they see? That is one of the central questions. Mainstream scholars often read Inanna condemnation as punishment for her transgression. She entered the underworld improperly. She tried to extend her power into a realm that has its own sovereignty. She violated the me of the underworld. On that reading, the Anunnaki are not judging her entire moral history. They are enforcing jurisdiction. That interpretation is strong. It fits the repeated warning at the gates. Do not speak against the rights of the underworld. It fits the fact that even a goddess must submit. It shows the underworld as a realm whose laws override the claims of the world above. But the source also points toward a broader possibility. The same kind of judgment formula appears in related descent traditions. Perhaps the look of the Anunnaki became a conventional way of describing underworld processing. Perhaps every arrival was seen, not in the same deadly way as Inanna, but with the same direct administrative perception. For ordinary mortals, the judgment could not simply be death, because the person was already dead. So what was it? Assignment, placement, registration. The dead were sorted into the underworld community. This is where the Sumerian afterlife differs from many later expectations. It is not a bright paradise for the good and a fiery punishment for the wicked. The underworld is one destination for all, but not one condition for all. The differences matter. Kings can remain kings. Priests can remain priests. Those with descendants can receive offerings. Those without heirs suffer. Those with proper burial fare differently from those abandoned or improperly handled. The Anunnaki do not simply decide whether a soul is good or bad. They administer a system. The coldness of that idea is easy to miss. A moral judgment can at least feel personal. An administrative judgment is colder. It classifies. It places. It enters a name. It may be fair by its own rules, but fairness is not the same as tenderness. This returns us to the stripping. If the gates remove every attribute that belongs to the upper world, what stands before the judges? Not the office, not the crown, not the jewels, not wealth, not the visible instruments of identity. Something more basic remains. The Sumerians had terms for the continuing dead. Gidim in Sumerian, Etemu in Akkadian. A ghost, a surviving, animated presence, but not a floating abstraction detached from need. It was a continued being that still remembered, hungered, thirsted, and depended on ritual care. The body returned to earth, but the ghost remained part of a network of obligation. The source explains that Sumerian ideas of the inner person were plural. There was not just one simple soul in the later philosophical sense. There was the Gidim or Etemu, the ghostly continuation most relevant to the underworld. There was also the Zikiki, a wind-like and dream-like emanation, associated with sleep and dreams, less dangerous, less central, more like a passing shadow than an administrative problem. The Gidim needed management. That is the whole point. If it was not processed, fed, recorded, and placed, it could become restless. The dead could afflict the living. Bad dreams, illness, misfortune, haunting, all could be understood as signs that the boundary system had failed. The underworld was not only for the dead. It protected the living from improperly settled dead. This makes the gates and judges more practical within the logic of the culture. A soul arrives carrying the record of a human life. It may still have status, debts, family ties, burial conditions, unfinished relationships, ritual needs. The system strips away the costume and then registers the remaining entity in relation to all those factors. A clerk must know who has arrived. A judge must know where to place it. A fate decreer must issue the condition. A family above must continue its offerings. Now return to Inanna. She is not an ordinary human soul, but her descent reveals the structure, because if even she must submit, no mortal can hope to bypass it. Her regalia falls away. Her protests are silenced. Her body becomes subject to the law below. The Anunnaki look, speak, and pronounce. She is turned into a corpse. The text is severe, but we keep the telling soft. There is no need to linger on violence. The horror is not in the body. The horror is in the system working exactly as intended. A goddess crosses the boundary, and the machinery of the underworld receives her without awe. Yet the story does not end with her death. Inanna will eventually be restored, but even restoration requires substitution. Someone must take her place. The underworld does not release without balance. It does not forgive a gap in its ledger. Ledger. That word returns again and again. Death in this tradition has a book-like quality, a record quality. Names written, places assigned, offerings tracked, conditions maintained. It is not enough to feel grief. The living must perform grief correctly. It is not enough that the dead once lived. They must be integrated. The tablet under museum glass becomes heavier in the mind. A clay object, small enough to hold, preserves a system too large to hold. It tells us that a goddess was stripped at 7 gates and brought before judges. It implies that ordinary souls, too, entered a structured realm where the underworld rites could not be argued with. What remains when everything is taken? A name, a ghost, a record, a need. Perhaps that is why the Sumerian afterlife feels so haunting. It does not offer easy escape from identity. It removes the ornaments, but not the consequences. It strips the self, but not the life that formed it. It takes away the ring, the garment, the measuring line, the outward signs, then asks what the soul carries when it has nothing left to perform with. The answer waits in the next layer of the tradition. To understand what the Anunnaki process, we must understand the thing that survives death. The Gidem, de Etemmo, the strange divine human remnant that still hungers in the dark. The thing that survives death is not simple. The Sumerians did not imagine a person as one clean, bright soul stepping away from the body like a bird from a branch. Their picture was older, heavier, and more crowded. A living person was made of parts: breath, body, name, memory, family, food, status, burial, obligation, and something ghostly that did not vanish when the body returned to clay. That ghostly thing was called the Giddim in Sumerian. In Akkadian, the later language that carried so much of Sumerian thought forward, it was called the Etemu. Say that softly. Etemmo. It is not quite the modern idea of a soul floating free and pure. It is not only a shadow either. It is a continuing presence, a remainder of the person, a ghost that still carries personality, memory, hunger, thirst, and the marks of the life that formed it. The Etemu is not finished with the world simply because the body is finished with breath. This is why the underworld needed a system. A thing that still wants food must be fed. A thing that still remembers must be settled. A thing that still belongs to a family must be placed in relation to that family. A thing that can become restless must be managed before it troubles the living. The source connects this idea to the old Atrahasis tradition, where humans are made from clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain god. In that story, humanity is not merely mud shaped into useful hands. Humanity carries something divine inside the clay. A spark, an intelligence, a fragment of a god who think, work, and remember. Some scholars treat this carefully as mythic theology, not as a literal anatomy of the soul. That caution matters. Ancient language does not always map cleanly onto modern categories. Still, the idea is powerful. The part of a human that survives death may be the part that was never fully clay to begin with. The body returns to the earth. The divine fragment continues. Imagine a grave at dusk. The soil is newly closed. A libation pipe descends into the ground. Family members stand nearby, tired from mourning, perhaps too tired even to weep properly anymore. Someone pours water or beer through the pipe. The liquid disappears into darkness. It is not symbolic only. In the logic of the culture, it is nourishment, a supply line, a gesture that says, "You are dead, but you are not outside our obligations." This is one of the most haunting things about Mesopotamian afterlife belief. The dead needed the living. A person with descendants could receive offerings. A person without descendants might suffer hunger below. Food for the dead was not a metaphor in any simple way. Texts speak of bitter bread and brackish water in the underworld. They speak of ghosts needing libations. They speak of the danger of neglected dead. Death did not remove dependence. It changed its address. The Atemu could be at rest if handled properly. But if burial was neglected, if rites were incomplete, if no one poured offerings, if the dead were not correctly entered into the order below, the ghost could wander. It could haunt. It could afflict. It could press into dreams, illness, confusion, and misfortune. To ancient Mesopotamian minds, some suffering among the living could mean that a dead person had not been properly settled. This is not superstition in the shallow sense. It is a worldview in which family, ritual, body, earth, and memory are tied together so tightly that one broken link pulls on all the others. Alongside the Gidem or Etemu, the source mentions another component, the Tsikik. The Tsikik is harder to hold in the mind. It is wind-like, sexless, sometimes bird-like, associated with dreams. It can leave the body during sleep, which helps explain why a dream might carry a person into places the waking body never reached. It also descends after death, but it receives less attention in the ritual record because it is not the dangerous one. It does not haunt the living in the same way. It does not require the same maintenance. It pass. The Atemu remains as the problem. Honestly, there is something almost tender in that distinction. The dream part goes like a little bird into the dark. The ghost part stays close to hunger, family, burial, and unfinished memory. The part that causes trouble is the part that is still most human. Now return to the 7 gates with this in mind. If the gates strip status, wealth, and power, then what finally stands before the Anunnaki is not a crown, not a ring, not a garment, not a social performance. It is the ghostly remainder carrying the record of a life, not a modern moral transcript, perhaps, but a layered file of conditions. Who the person was, how the person died, whether the person was buried, whether the family remained, whether offerings would continue, whether the rites were known and performed. The underworld then becomes a registry for difficult remains. The Anunnaki are not only judges in the dramatic sense. They are administrators of transition. They receive the arrival, and the arrival is not blank. The Atemu brings information. It brings the weight of life. It brings the social world into death. and the system must translate that into place. This brings us to Ur-Nama. He was not an anonymous soul. He was a king. Ur-Nama founded the third dynasty of Ur, built temples, dug canals, strengthened law, and presented himself as a shepherd of his people under divine order. His name belongs to one of Sumer's great ages of rebuilding and literary memory. Yet even a king reaches the road that goes down. The text called The Death of Ur-Nama gives us a rare case study. It does not speak only of the underworld in general. It follows a named king into the system. His death is presented as a shock, a rupture. The gods, the text says in effect, had altered his decree. Enlil had changed his fate. The trustworthy shepherd was taken before his time. Sumer mourned. His city mourned. His mother mourned. Inanna, absent from the divine assembly when the decree was made, later grieves and rages that the shepherd is gone. This is important because the system is not portrayed as gentle. It can operate correctly and still cause grief. Ur-Nama moves toward the underworld along a desolate road. Donkeys are buried with him. The procession is heavy with royal loss. Imagine the dust of the road, the weight of funeral gifts, the silence of a tondon, the sense that a king who once commanded canals and walls now depends on rites performed by the living. But Ur-Nama knows the rules. The text says he knows the rights of the netherworld. That phrase is crucial. He is not simply thrown into the dark. He has knowledge. He has preparation. He understands that entry requires protocol. First, he honors the 7 chief porters of the netherworld, the gate officials. The gates must be acknowledged. The guardians must be satisfied. This is not a bribe in the cheap sense. It is procedure. To enter a system, one must respect the offices that hold it together. Then the gifts are given. To Nergal, the powerful authority below, Ur-Nama presents weapons. A mace, a bow, arrows, a dagger, and a multicolored leather bag. A warrior gift for a warlike underworld lord. To Gilgamesh, now not only the old hero, but a judge among the dead, he gives a spear, a lion-headed mace, a shield, and a battle axe. Gifts that speak the language of strength, kingship, and judgment. To Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, he presents oil vessels, a fine bowl, royal garments, and the divine powers of the netherworld. To Dumuzi, he gives livestock and a golden scepter. To Namta, the one who decrees fates, he presents fine jewelry, a golden ring, and carnelian stones. To Hushbishog, wife of Namtar, he gives lapis lazuli and silver adornment. To Ningish-Zida, guardian and underworld power, he offers a chariot and fine donkeys. To the august underworld scribe, he presents a stylus and a measuring line. Pause there. A stylus for the scribe. Of all the gifts, that one feels especially cold and intimate. It is the gift you give to the official whose work you need most. Not a weapon, not a jewel, a tool of writing. Ur-Nama acknowledges that his name must be written, his place registered, his condition entered into the order below. Death has a clerk. The gift recognizes the hand that will record him. If you were standing beside that underworld table, you might hear nothing but the soft placing of objects. A mace set down. A ring placed near lamplight that is not quite light. A vessel of oil. A stylus. The gestures are calm, but every gesture matters. One wrong omission, one failed protocol, one unhonored official, and the outcome might change. After the gifts are properly presented, the text records the result. The Inanna seat, Ur-Nama, on a great dais in the netherworld. They establish a dwelling place for him. At the command of Ereshkigal and with Gilgamesh, his beloved brother, he will pass judgments of the netherworld and render decisions concerning certain dead. The king remains kingly below. His social status is preserved, but not automatically. The text makes the process visible. His honorable position follows correct protocol. He knew the rites. He brought the gifts. He honored the officials. The system received him and assigned him a role. But then the grief returns. Ur-Nama has been honored, yet he mourns. He cannot complete the wall of Ur. He cannot hold his sons on his knees. He cannot embrace his wife. The system has worked, but it has not comforted him fully. That is what makes the text feel so human. Even a good afterlife assignment is still separation. Even royal placement below does not restore the smell of the city at dawn, the sound of children, the warmth of a living hand. The underworld is orderly, but order is not mercy. The fire near us lowers. A coal folds inward. The room grows quieter. Now we know more about the system. It processes not a vague soul, but the atemmu, the ghostly surviving part that carries identity, hunga, memory, and obligation. It can place a king on a dais. It can reward correct preparation. It can maintain a hierarchy below that mirrors the world above. The road to the underworld is therefore not only a road for the dead. It is a road built partly by the living. Every wrapped body, every poured drink, every spoken name, every object placed in the grave becomes part of that road. Ur-Nama travels it as a king, but he still needs the same basic mercy that every dead person needs. The living must not forget how to send him onward. Yet one question remains open. What about ordinary souls? Not kings with gift lists and attendants, not goddesses at 7 gates. What happened to everyone else? The child, the soldier, the man with no heir, the one buried badly, the one lost in the desert. For that, the tradition gives us another strange witness, Enkidu, who came up from the underworld long enough to tell Gilgamesh what he had seen. Enkidu comes back as a voice, not fully alive, not restored into friendship in the old warm way. The tradition gives us something stranger, a brief opening, a crack between worlds. Made possible through the sun god Utu. Gilgamesh has lost his companion to the netherworld, and grief presses him toward questions that no living person can answer. So Enkidu rises, or rather, his Gidam rises, enough to speak. Imagine the scene softly. The ground opens not like a spectacle, but like a wound allowed to breathe. Dust lifts. The air cools. Gilgamesh stands at the edge, king of Uruk, builder of walls, restless friend, and now a man who needs a report from the dark. Enkidu voice comes from below, carrying not comfort exactly, but information. The conversation that follows is structured. Gilgamesh asks. Enkidu answers. Again and again. What of this person? What of that one? What is the condition of those who died in this way, or lived with that circumstance, or left behind this many sons? It reads almost like a survey of the underworld. That may sound too modern, but the pattern is there. Question. Answer. Category. Outcome. The dead are not described as one indistinct crowd. They are sorted by conditions. Those who had many children fare better than those with fewer. A man with 7 sons sits on a throne and hears judgments. The number sounds full, blessed, socially complete. He has descendants to pour offerings, remember his name, and maintain his connection. The dead person with living heirs remains tied to the world above through ongoing care. The man with no heir suffers. He eats bread like a kiln-fired brick, dry, hard, barely food. The phrase is simple and devastating. No descendant pour libation. No living hand keeps the supply line open. The underworld provides something, but it is bitter, lifeless, almost punitive in texture. This is not a modern moral judgment. It is relational. The condition of the dead depends on the living. The stillborn child receives a surprisingly tender fate. The one who never drew breath and never received a name plays at a table of silver and gold, with sweet things. In a system where many outcomes depend on social position, descendant, burial, and ritual maintenance, this tenderness stands out. The child who never accumulated debt, obligation, or social failure is not treated as a problem. The child is sheltered. That small mercy in the text is worth keeping. Not everything below is cold procedure. The mode of death matters too. Those who fell in battle are supported by father and mother. Their heads are held. They are not abandoned in the dark. Those who died in the desert are restless, never at peace. The open desert death is terrible because the body may not receive proper burial. The ghost may not enter the system correctly. The dead who were burned are described differently. Their ghost absent from the underworld, their smoke gone upward. The logic is clear inside the tradition. Burial is not only disposal of a body. It is an interface. It opens the correct route. It connects the Atemmu to the underworld administration. Without burial, without rites, without offerings, the soul may not settle where it belongs. A ghost outside the system is dangerous. This brings us back to the living. A neglected dead person could haunt. An improperly buried one could trouble dreams. A spirit without offerings might press illness, fear, and misfortune into a household. Ritual specialists were called to diagnose and address such disturbances, not by inventing random charms, but by completing what had failed. Missing offerings, missing burial rites, missing names, missing recognition. In this worldview, a haunting is not merely a frightening event. It is an administrative failure. Someone has not been entered properly into death. That is a grim thought, and a strangely organized one. Enkidu report suggests that the underworld system used multiple factors: social status, number of descendants, mode of death, quality of burial, continuation of offerings, ritual correctness. A king and a poor man do not enter the same condition. A father with many sons and a man with none do not fare the same. A person buried with care and one lost outside the rites do not rest alike. The source calls this almost like a sorting algorithm, and the phrase fits if we keep it gentle. The Sumerians did not imagine a single simple test. The system receives many inputs and produces an assignment. Not heaven or hell. Not saved or damned. A place within a structured underworld community. Think of a city below the soil. Not a pleasant city. Not a place of laughter and clean water. But a city with ranks, officials, scribes, judges, and supply lines. The poor remain poor. The honored remain honored. The hungry remain hungry unless the living feed them. The dead continue, but under dimmer conditions and stricter laws. That is where the Anunnaki sit. They are not only mythic figures at the end of a goddess story. They are the final court in a system that includes many officials, gatekeepers at the gates, Neti at the entrance, Ereshkigal on the throne, Nergal as executive authority below in later tradition, Numtar, the fate cutter, issuing decrees, Inanna, or another underworld scribe, writing names, Gilgamesh as judge, Utu, the sun, passing through by night. The underworld has departments. Again, there is an uneasy little humor in it. The dead may have escaped taxes, but not administration. Yet the humor fades when we meet Nergal and Ereshkigal. Their myth shows that the underworld itself has a political history. It was not a frozen machine from the beginning of time. The story begins with a divine feast in heaven. Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, cannot attend because she cannot leave her realm. So she sends Namtar to receive her portion. Namtar enters the feast as emissary of the dead. Everyone should show respect. Nergal does not. The offense seems small at first. A failure to rise. A failure to honor the messenger properly. But in divine politics, small gestures carry heavy meanings. Ereshkigal demands that Nergal be sent down to answer for it. Ea, wise and cautious, prepares Nergal for the descent. In one version, Nergal is given protective demons to place at the underworld gates. Each threshold becomes contested. He does not arrive like an ordinary soul. He forces his way down with power and protection. The story exists in different versions. In the shorter version, it feels like a hostile takeover. Nergal confronts Ereshkigal and seizes rule. In the longer version, there is a more emotional and romantic entanglement. Nergal and Ereshkigal become linked, and Nergal returns to the underworld as her counterpart. Later tradition harmonizes them as joint rulers of the dead. The details differ, and we should not pretend they do not. But the structural point remains. The governance of the underworld can change. Nergal becomes an executive authority below. Ereshkigal remains queen. Namtar continues to decree fates. The gates remain. The judges remain. The scribal functions remain. The system survives a change of power. That is important. The underworld is an institution more durable than any one divine office holder. A new ruler may arrive. Authority may be negotiated or seized. But the me of the underworld, the ordinances and procedures, continue. The dead still come. The gates still stand. The names still must be written. Now bring in Utu, the sun god, above the earth. Utu is light, justice, vision, the one who sees. But every evening, when the sun sets in the west, Sumerian thought does not simply let him disappear. Utu travels through the underworld at night, moving beneath the world so that he may rise again in the east. The sun passes through death every night. That image is beautiful, and it changes the system. The underworld is not permanently without light. It receives a nightly visitor, a judge whose authority above is tied to truth and seeing. Some texts describe Utu as participating in judgment of the dead alongside the Anunnaki and other divine powers. So the soul processing system is not just intake at the beginning. It is continuous administration. New arrivals are received. Existing souls are maintained. Disputes may be judged. Restless ghosts may need attention. Conditions can be affected by offerings from above. The world below is not a warehouse of the dead. It is an active bureaucracy, and each night the sun moves through it like a lamp carried down a corridor. Imagine that corridor. All day, Utu has crossed the sky, seeing the living, witnessing contracts, creams, prayers, births, markets, and lies told with straight faces. At sunset, he enters the western gate. His light lowers, but it does not die. It turns under the earth. In the darkness of Ker, for a while, there is a golden passing. Judges convene. Names are read. Conditions are known. Then, before morning, he leaves. The living see sunrise and think the day has begun. Below, the dead return to dimness. This nightly rhythm ties the living and dead together. The same sun that shines on a field also passes through the realm where the field owner's ancestors may be waiting for water poured through a pipe. The same light that witnesses a contract above may illuminate a judgment below. The system is total. That is why burial mattered so much. A grave was not only a place where grief ended, it was a point of contact, a doorway kept in miniature. The body lay below, and above it the living could still pour water, beer, or offerings through a pipe into the earth. The liquid disappeared into darkness, but in the Sumerian imagination it did not vanish. It traveled along obligation. A family that maintained the grave maintained the dead. A family that forgot the grave left the dead hungry. This is a hard idea, but also a human one. We still feel, in our own ways, that the dead ask something of us. A flower, a nama spoken aloud, a photograph kept, a story told carefully. The Sumerians gave that feeling structure. They made it ritual. They made it practical. If the rites were performed, the ghost could be quiet. If the rites failed, the ghost might return in dreams. Later, when excavators opened royal tombs at they found objects that make this system feel less abstract. Gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, weapons, vessels, musical instruments, and carefully placed bodies lay in silence beneath the earth. We cannot prove that every object matched one underworld official, but the resemblance to the gift lists is difficult to ignore. The grave looked less like storage and more like preparation. And now, with Enkidu report, Urnamma gifts, Nergal rule, Utu nightly passage, and the ghostly hunger of the Atemu before us. The great below feels less like blank darkness. It feels like a place with records. And somewhere in that darkness, a scribe waits with a stylus. Somewhere in that darkness, a scribe waits with a stylus. That image is small, but it changes everything. A sword can frighten the body. A gate can stop the feet. A throne can command the eyes. But a stylus, held by a patient divine clerk in the underworld, reaches something quieter. It reaches the name. And in the Sumerian imagination, a name was not a casual sound. A name held identity, memory, plus, and obligation. To be written was to be entered into order. To be unwritten was to risk wandering. So the soul comes down. It has passed through the gates, or it is being prepared to pass. It has left the warm noise of the living world behind. Above, a house may still smell of smoke and bread. A wife may sit beside a cold place where someone used to sleep. A son may pour water into the grave pipe. A daughter may touch the edge of a garment and remember a voice. Below, the Atemu approaches the administration of the dead. The scribe writes, "The name joins the underworld registry." This is not a metaphor the way we often use that word, lightly, as if metaphor means unreal. In ancient Mesopotamian thinking, writing itself had force. A written name could preserve, bind, identify, and authorize. The living kept accounts of grain, labor, land, offerings, and kings because record-keeping made society possible. The dead, too, entered record. That is why the gift to the underworld scribe in the death of Urnamma matters so much. A stylus for the one who writes. A measuring line for the one who registers. The king recognizes that his afterlife condition depends not only on power or memory, but on correct entry into a system. The scribe is not decorative. The scribe is necessary. Now we step into the burial evidence, softly, because here the clay texts and the earth itself begin to speak together. In the winter of 1927, Leonard Woolley and his team excavated at the ancient city of They had already found ordinary graves, the kind one expects in an ancient city. A body placed in the ground with a few goods. Aveshel. A tool. Ornaments, if the family could provide them. Then the excavation changed. They reached the royal cemetery. The earth opened into chambers and death pits unlike the simple burials around them. Gold. Lapis lazuli. Silver. Carnelian. Musical instruments. Weapons. Vessels. Headdresses. Bodies arranged with deliberate care. Some tombs held rulers, but also attendants, musicians, soldiers, and servants placed around them, as if the royal household had been extended below the earth. It is a dark thing to describe, so we keep it quiet. People went into death with their lord or lady. Modern scholarship debates the exact means and ritual context, and we should not pretend certainty about every detail. But the broad interpretation is that these retainers were meant to continue service in the afterlife. The palace, in some sense, continued below. The household crossed the threshold together. That belief fits the texts. If kings remained kings beneath the earth, if judges remained judges, if status continued in an underworld form, then royal tombs were not only memorials, they were preparations for office. The ruler needed attendants. The ruler needed goods. The ruler needed objects suited to passage and position. The grave goods are striking because they resemble the categories named in the afterlife texts. Weapons for underworld powers. Bowls and vessels for royal or divine figures. Gold rings. Lapis. Carnelian. Garments. Instruments. Chariots or vehicles in some traditions. Donkeys in the death of Ur-Nama. These were not random luxuries tossed in by grief alone. They may have been equipment. Not equipment for a journey across a visible desert. Equipment for an administrative encounter. Imagine the objects laid out before burial. A cup turned in lamplight. A bead of lapis, blue as the deep sky. A blade polished by hands that know it will no longer be used above. A headdress heavy with gold. A musician instrument, silent already, prepared to continue in a place where no living ear can follow. The mourners do not know, in any modern, testable way, what happens next. But they know the rites. They know what should be placed. They know who must be honored. They know that the dead should not arrive empty-handed before officials who expect recognition. The burial is not only goodbye, it is provisioning. It is paperwork made of objects. A grave pipe makes the idea even more intimate. Through it, offerings could be poured into the earth after burial. Water, beer, Libacean. The living do not merely remember the dead ones and walk away. They maintain a channel, a thin, dark route from hand to soil to the hungry ghost below. Think of that sound. Liquid poured into clay. A small glug, then silence. Above, a person stands in the sun or at dusk, holding the vessel. Below, in the imagination of the culture, the Atemmu receives relief. Without such offerings, the dead may eat bitter bread and drink brackish water. With them, the dead remain connected to family. to name, to household, to human care. The mourning period also matters. 7 days, often associated with the transition. 7 again. 7 gates. 7 judges. 7 days in which grief is not only emotion, but ritual work. The living help the dead separate properly. The body is cared for. The name is spoken. The offerings begin. The family learns the new shape of its obligations. There is a severe tenderness in this. The dead are not abandoned to whatever happens next. The living participate in the passage. They cannot enter Kur and argue before the Anunnaki. They cannot pull the Atemmu back from the great below. But they can prepare. They can equip. They can feed. They can remember. And if they fail, the failure can return. Mesopotamian texts speak often of ghost affliction. A restless Giddim may cause illness, bad dreams, fear, misfortune, and disturbances that required ritual specialists. The Yashipu, often translated as exorcist, and the Yasu, physician, worked within a world where physical suffering and spiritual disorder could overlap. A ghost outside its place was not only tragic, it was an operational problem. The remedy was often to finish the unfinished process, offer what was missing, perform the rites, name the dead, provide burial if burial failed, pour libation, restore the channel, send the ghost back into order. This is why the underworld system pressed upward into daily life. It shaped inheritance. A person needed heirs not only for property, but for afterlife care. It shaped burial practice. It shaped family duty. It shaped professional ritual knowledge. It made the dead a continuing part of household administration. The dead did not simply leave. They changed departments. That line may sound dry, but it carries the whole worldview. The living city had scribes, judges, officials, gates, offerings, and households. The dead city mirrored it. Cosmic mirroring is one of the source tradition main ideas. What exists above has its counterpart below. Heaven has assemblies. Cities have courts. The underworld has judges. The household above has servants. The household below may need them too. This is where the royal cemetery becomes especially haunting. Stand before a gold headdress from and you are not only seeing beauty, you are seeing an object selected for death. Its gold leaves, flowers, and beads once rested near a human body whose life was folded into a system of afterlife expectation. The lapis on a necklace is not just decoration. It is a sign of status, value, and preparation. A lyre is not only music, but perhaps continuity of courtly life below. The museum glass makes the objects clean. The story behind them is not clean. It is grief, hierarchy, faith, fear, and administrative imagination braided together. Now return to Nergal and Ereshkigal. Their story reminds us that the underworld administration itself had a history. Ereshkigal was queen of the dead. Nergal, through offense, dissent, confrontation, and in some versions, desire, became her co-ruler. The details differ across versions, but the result becomes stable in later tradition. Joint rule, shared authority below. This matters because the system survives political change. Nerhal kan enter. Power can shift. The myth can remember a kind of divine takeover. Yet the gates remain. The judges remain. Namtar decrees. The scribe writes. The dead are still processed. The institution is more durable than its officers. That is a chillingly familiar idea. Administrations outlive the people who run them. Even in myth, the office remains after the ruler changes. Utu adds another layer. Every night, the sun god passes through the underworld. His light, linked to justice above, enters the land of the dead below. This makes the system continuous rather than static. The underworld is not only a place where souls arrive once. It is monitored, judged, revisited, lit briefly by the same God who sees the living world by day. At sunset, Utu descends. During the night, he passes through the dead. At dawn, he rises again. The living call it morning. The dead have had their brief visitation of light. If you were listening in the great below, perhaps you would know the rhythm. Darkness. Waiting. The sound of names. The dull hunger of ghosts. Then, somewhere far off, a gold edge. Utu moving through. The judge of the living briefly among the dead. Then darkness again. This cycle joins the worlds. A person pours libation into earth. The sun passes beneath. A restless ghost troubles a dream. A ritual specialist answers. A name is written. A family remembers. Above and below. The system exchanges obligations. The source eventually presents 3 interpretations of all this, and we should prepare for them gently. One reading says this is mythology in the deepest sense, a symbolic account of death, identity loss, memory, grief, and social continuity. The 7 gates show what dying does to us. Stripping away status, wealth, beauty, authority, and role. The Anunnaki represent ultimate accountability. The underworld registry represents the human need to be remembered. That reading is strong. Another reading says the system encodes spiritual wisdom or ritual initiation. The descent is not only about death after life, but about transformation before death. The gates become stages of surrender. The stripped goddess becomes the initiate who must lose false identity to meet deeper truth. That reading also has force. The third reading is more unsettling. It says the tablets preserve memory, not merely metaphor. A real belief in a real system, inherited from older traditions and treated as operationally relevant. The named officials, exact gifts, gates, scribes, and procedures are not decorative, but documentary in spirit. We cannot settle it completely. The tablets do not allow that, but they do allow awe. They show a civilization that imagined death with administrative clarity. They show that the dead were not forgotten as mist. They were registered. fed, placed, maintained, corrected when wandering, honored through objects, connected through pipes and descendants. In the firelit room, that thought settles heavily but calmly. The Sumerians may not answer the final question of what death is, but they reveal what they feared and hoped it might be. Not chaos, not mercy, not nothing. A system, a soul arriving below, a gate opening, a scribe waiting, and a name entering clay. A name enters clay, and the story returns to the tablet. After the gates, after Inanna stripped of her powers, after Nama with his gifts, after Enkidu voice from below, after Nergal and Ereshkigal in their uneasy rule, after Utu carrying light beneath the world, we are back in the museum hush. The tablet waits under glass. It does not explain itself beyond the signs. It does not lean toward one interpretation. It does not say, I am only a myth. It does not say, I am a map. It does not say, I am a memory of something the living have forgotten. It remains clay, marked by a hand, preserved by accident, held by institutions, read by scholars, and now carried into this quiet room beside the fire. The source offers 3 ways to understand the system, and all 3 deserve a place in the candlelight. The first is the mythological reading. On this view, the Sumerian soul processing system is a symbolic theology of death. The 7 gates are the stripping that all humans face. At death, the body loses strength. The face loses recognition. Wealth no longer answers. Offices end. Beauty fades. Titles fall quiet. Even the proudest ruler must become an arrival. Inanna descent becomes an image of that universal undoing. She begins with crown, yevils, power, and identity. She ends bare before the judges. Every human being, whether king or farmer, priest or child, must eventually stand without the decorations that made life seem stable. That reading is powerful because death does work that way. It removes. It takes away the borrowed signs. A house can remain, but the owner cannot sleep there. A ring can remain, but the hand is still. A name can remain, but only if others speak it. The self becomes dependent, in a way pride never enjoys thinking about. In this reading, the Anunnaki are not literal clerks in a dark office below the soil. They are the image of final accountability. The underworld registry is the human longing not to be lost. The gifts to underworld officials are the values, relationships, and duties carried across the threshold of memory. The offerings from descendants are the truth that the dead continue to live in obligations, grief, inheritance, and stories. This interpretation does not make the tablets less beautiful. It makes them psychologically precise. The second reading is the encoded wisdom reading. Here, the underworld is not simply a place after death, but a pattern of transformation. Inanna descent may reflect initiatory experience, ritual drama, sacred instruction, or a spiritual passage in which the living person symbolically dies, loses false power, meets the dark and returns changed. Some scholars have noted that the descent and return pattern appears in many ancient traditions. A figure goes below. They are stripped. They die or nearly die. They are revived. They return with knowledge, but never without cost. Inanna comes back. Yet another must take her place. The underworld does not release without balance. In this reading, the gates are interior gates. Territorial power must fall. Status must fall. Attraction must fall. Wealth must fall. Planning must fall. Leadership must fall. Identity itself must be surrendered. Only then can something deeper be seen. This is not so far from what many traditions later discover in other languages, that to know the hidden truth, one must pass through loss. The Sumerians, being administrators of almost everything, may have described that inner passage as an underworld procedure because procedure was the language of their civilization. There is something elegant in that. The soul is processed because the self must be unmade before it can be known. The third reading is the preserved memory reading. This is the one with the deepest edge. On this view, the tablets preserve the record of a system the Sumerians believed was genuinely operational. The Anunnaki were not merely symbols, but real beings within their worldview, divine administrators who governed the passage of the dead. The gates, gifts, names, scribes, and judges are precise because they were believed to matter. A soul that knew the rites, received burial, brought proper gifts, and had living descendants fared differently from one that did not. The source does not force us to accept that as literal reality. It simply asks us to notice the detail. Why name the officials? Why list the gifts? Why preserve the gate sequence? Why describe the scribe tool? Why connect grave goods, libation, descendant, modes of death, and underworld outcome so consistently across texts? A pure symbol can be brief. A system requires procedure. The preserved memory reading says the procedure matters because the Sumerians thought it worked. The honest answer is that we cannot finally know. We cannot follow a Gidam through the gates. We cannot see whether Namtar still decrees fate. We cannot check the underworld registry for names written in clay or shadow. We cannot ask Utu what he sees when his light passes beneath the earth. The tablets are evidence, not proof of everything they describe. And yet, evidence is not nothing. They show what was recorded, what was copied, what was taught, what was carried across centuries of scribal labor. They show that ancient Mesopotamian thinkers imagined death not as a vague disappearance, but as a structured transition that required knowledge, proper ritual, and continuing care from the living. That alone is enough to make the room quieter. Think again of the tablet NI368. Pale sand colored, wedge marked, stored carefully now, after all the accidents that could have destroyed it. The line from the great heaven, she set her mind on the great below, still begins the descent. It is simple, direct, and impossible to forget. A mind turns downward. A goddess chooses the path. The gates are already waiting. That may be the most unsettling part. The system is already there before Inanna arrives. She does not create it by descending. She reveals it. The underworld laws were in place. The gatekeeper knew what to do. Ereshkigal ruled. The Anunnaki judged. The rights of the underworld could not be argued away. Inanna tested the system, and the system answered. Then consider Ur-Nama, a known king, with a name, a dynasty, city works, reforms, and grief. He enters the system properly, with gifts, officials, and protocol. He is seated honorably. He becomes a judge below. And still he mourns the life above. The wall unfinished. The sons not held. The wife not embraced. That detail saves the story from becoming only mechanical. The system may be orderly, but the dead still grieve. Then consider Enkidu. His report does not say everyone is the same below. It says conditions differ. Children matter. Burial matters. Descendant matter. The way one dies matters. The care of the living matters. The dead are sorted not by one simple moral line, but by a mesh of social, ritual, and material conditions. That is hard for a modern listener. It feels unfair in places. A person without heirs suffers. A person improperly buried may wander. Yet this is also what makes the system historically revealing. It mirrors Sumerian society, where household, lineage, office, ritual, and record shaped every part of life. Death did not erase the city. It extended it downward. Now the royal cemetery of Ur comes back into view. The gold headdress, the lapis beads, the musical instruments, the bodies arranged in silence, the grave goods placed with care. These things can be admired as art, but the texts ask us to look deeper. They may also be tools for passage, gifts for officials, equipment for a continued household below. A grave becomes an interface. A burial becomes a preparation. A libation pipe becomes a supply line. Memory becomes maintenance. If the dead were at peace, the living could sleep. If the dead were neglected, the boundary could fail. This is why the Sumerian system feels so dark, and yet strangely comforting. It does not imagine death as meaningless chaos. It gives it order. A severe order, yes. A cold order, but order. There are gates. There are names. There are roles. There are duties the living can perform. There are ways to help. Perhaps that is one reason the tradition lasted. Fear becomes bearable when it has a ritual. Grief becomes bearable when it has a task. The living cannot rescue the dead from the great below, but they can pour water. They can speak a name. They can place a gift. They can bury carefully. They can remember on the proper days. They can prevent the soul from becoming hungry, forgotten, and restless. That is not a small comfort. The Sumerians lived in cities that depended on fragile systems. Canals had to be maintained. Fields had to be measured. Grain had to be stored. Temples had to be supplied. Kingship had to be legitimized. Scribal records had to be accurate. It is perhaps natural that they imagined death the same way, not as absence, but as another system requiring correct relationship. Above, the living city. Below, the city of the dead. Between them, clay, vater, offerings, names, and memory. The fire beside us is nearly low now. The room is quiet enough to hear the small settling of wood, the soft collapse of ash, the faint movement of air at the candle. The story has moved through museums, ruins, gates, graves, old scholars, and underworld courts. It has not given certainty. It should not. Certainty would be too loud for tablets this old. What it gives, instead, is a question with weight. What did the Sumerians think waited after death? The answer, in their clay record, was not silence. It was arrival, a descent through gates, a stripping of power, a ghost still hungry and remembering, a court of divine administrators, a scribe, a registry, a place assigned according to rules that were older than the soul arriving there. Whether we call this myth, wisdom, or preserved memory, it is one of the most complete ancient visions of death ever pressed into clay. It is frightening because it is orderly. It is soothing because it is not empty. And perhaps that is why the tablet still matters. It does not ask us to believe everything in the way the ancient scribe believed it. It asks us to recognize the seriousness of the question. It asks us to sit for a while with the possibility that human beings 4,000 years ago were already thinking about death with a complexity we still struggle to match. The tablet waited. Under soil. In archives. In museum storage. Under careful light. It waited while its scribes vanished. While its cities fell. While its gods changed names. While languages died. While scholars relearned the script sign by sign. It waited for someone to read again the line that begins the descent. From the great heaven, she set her mind on the great below. Now the line has reached us. The candle bends. The room darkens. The imagined staircase fades into shadow. The 7 gates stand far away, closed for now. The scribe below keeps the stylus ready, patient as clay, patient as dust, patient as all things that outlast the living. Rest here, above the earth, where the fire is still warm. Let the old Sumerian questions remain unanswered, but not unheard. Let the names of the dead stay soft in the mind. Let the tablet return to its quiet case. Let the great below close its doors for the night. Good night,